Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first, it's kind of the first Timefold webinar, at least since we've rebooted it. Welcome on this, I hope, warm summer day where you're going to spend some time either inside or outside listening to this webinar. I hope for you outside with a nice, refreshing beverage, but welcome. As a major player in the search and planning optimization space, we find it very important that we also share that knowledge so that we can bring in more people to the space and educate them on all these sorts of problems like the vehicle routing problem that we will be discussing today. Today I will be joined by Geoffrey De Smet, who's our CTO and co-founder, and also the original creator of OptaPlanner. So welcome, Geoffrey.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
Good to have you here as well. I can see you're sitting at home, not too warm, I hope, ready to give a fun, warm, and energizing session?
Absolutely. Let's go for it, right?
Good. So when you approached me a while ago, we need to do a webinar and share our knowledge more. Why did you choose this one specifically as the first one?
There's a lot of vehicle routing problems, and the gain in vehicle routing problems is quite high. So because we reduce the travel time, and travel time, while doing that, we also reduce the driving time. We also reduce the distance, and this actually reduces the fuel consumption. So this has big benefits, both financially for the companies applying it, but also ecologically for just everybody else benefiting from the fact that they can do the same amount of work with less fuel, right? So I really like vehicle routing problems because of that. In all of the planning problems we solve, and so whenever gotten the choice, I would talk about those first before the others, while the others are very interesting too, of course.
Yeah, and when I first joined Timefold, I got a big introduction for, I think, almost a day, so I don't think we will be able to cover everything today. But you mentioned a lot of abbreviations, VRP, CVRP. I'm pretty sure you'll go a bit into those today. But I also know that you're a big board game player. So did you ever use those abbreviations on like a Scrabble board, try to cheat your way in?
No. I don't play Scrabble that much. I'm not too good at finding good words. But yeah, it might be a good way, right? Because if you think about all of the variants on VRP, well, I'm sure you can score a lot of points with Scrabble that way, I'm sure.
So if anything, today people will learn a lot about VRP and add a few new abbreviations they can add on the Scrabble board if they want to cheat. So without further ado, Geoffrey, I'm just going to hand the word to you. There's only one thing I still want to mention. The audience can ask questions anytime in YouTube chat, as long as it's somewhat VRP related. I will be moderating and I will interrupt and jump in Geoffrey's session if it's relevant, the questions. If it's a little less relevant for the topic he's discussing at the moment, I'll keep the questions for the end. And if we don't have enough time or it doesn't fully fit in, then we'll commit to answering those questions in a follow-up somewhere. Yep. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump backstage and the floor is yours, Geoffrey.
Yeah, and I see some questions coming in already, Tom, and I see that last question there. Is actually quite interesting to maybe just start with. So is there any plan to add an example for pickup and delivery? Yes, there is. And actually, we have a version already. So it's not yet publicly available, but we have a beta version already. So if you want to, contact us if you want to try that out, basically. Yes, here we go. So let's say you have software, and in that software, you need to solve a problem, right? And so let's presume, first of all, your software deals with assigning vehicles to go to a number of locations, right? And so in your software, your users can actually schedule which vehicle goes to which location at which time. And for example, through a country like this. And then your UI, your scheduling UI might look something like this, right? Where you have a number of vehicles. And here we can see two technicians, Anne and Carl, and they are working a number of hours. And then we have a number of unassigned visits. For example, we need to send somebody to customer A, to customer B, and to customer C, and so forth. And each of these visits takes some time, and we need to decide which visit gets assigned to which vehicle, and of course, in which order they go to these vehicles. So if you're not using any kinds of optimization algorithms yet or technology, what you will do is you will probably just take one of these, and so your users will have to drag and drop these visits to these vehicles. So for example, they might take that first visit and assign it to Anne. And then of course your UI will recalculate and will say, okay, it takes an amount of time to drive from the depot or Anne's home location to visit A. That's an amount of travel time, and so forth, right? And so, and I just want to set the stage a little bit on what kind of what kind of problems we're solving here. And so then your users might take visit B, and they actually assign that before visit A, and then of course it recalculates those travel times as you see here. And going through that, your users will take visit C, assign that, will take visit D, assign that. And then when they start assigning a visit E, they will see, okay, when I assign that, I actually go over my available time. I have it takes too long. And then when they assign visits F, they might see the same thing. So they actually might decide to leave those two visits unassigned. And this is what we call, and this is planning, of course, scheduling, and then there's automatic verification, right? So these red dots here, these red things, this is automatic verification, and you might have that in your software already. But it's still manual scheduling because the users have to drag and drop each of their visits to their vehicles. So now suppose a feature request comes in from your users, from your customers, and they say, okay, I want you to actually do automatic scheduling, right? I want you to have this button where I click on, and all of these visits get actually assigned to my technicians. And I might still want to change some things manually, but 90%, 95% I want to do automatically. And so management is really pushing for this. The C-suite might actually get involved in this, and they actually might make some changes. They might just say, no, we don't want a schedule button. We want something different. We want a schedule with AI button. Does the same thing, basically, right? And so how does that look like? Well, it's very similar, except there's this one button extra in your application, schedule with AI. And when you click that, all of your visits just jump on the vehicles, and you might still make some changes after that, right? So, and this is, of course, what we're going to talk about automatic scheduling. And you might wonder, okay, what's the return on investment on this? Is it just purely the fact that we can plan faster? That's not really the case, because by doing this with algorithms, you can get a lot better results. Just to give you an idea, what we typically see if you go from manual planning to optimized planning is we typically see a gain of about $2,000 to $4,000 per year per vehicle, right? And in some of these cases, that can amount to a lot of money. Let me just show you one case, right? So I've been involved in many of these cases, and this particular case is quite interesting. They expected, when they went from their old system to the new system with our technology, to have 1% less driving time. Actually, it was 25% less driving time. Now, a small detail about this is that this is about more than 50,000 vehicles. So when you do that for 50,000 vehicles, this actually saves hundreds of millions of dollars per year, right? And it actually also saves tens of millions of kilograms CO2 emissions per year, right? And so we've seen that in production, same workloads year over year, right? So there's a huge benefit in optimizing vehicle routing problems and doing this efficiently, right? So it's clearly a competitive advantage. And this is also why, most people who do this, they don't really want to talk about it. It's hard to get case studies around this, right? So how do you add that schedule with AI in your software? Well, you might say it's just a button. How hard can it be? It's just a button, right? That's what we're going to talk about here, of course. Because as soon as you start looking into this, you will probably go through some of the research, right? And as you've seen from the title from this talk, is we're going to talk about when research meets reality. So let's first take a little closer look at the research part of all of this. So it actually has a name, this problem, right? As you'll probably already know, it's the vehicle routing problem, or the VRP problem, which you might remember also from university, together with the other problem, the traveling salesman problem, the TSP, which is basically just a one vehicle routing problem, right? That's how I'd like to call it, the traveling salesman problem. And when you look at what the traveling salesman problem does, let's first take a quick look at that. It's a very simplified version of this. This means you have one vehicle, and you need to go through all of these locations. And when you actually do that, and then we need to find the shortest path to go through all of these locations. And in this example, that might be the shortest path. And this is what a lot of research has been done about around the TSP and so forth. It was actually discovered in the 1800s already by Hamilton. And there's been a lot of work in the 1950s already around traveling salesman problem by Danzig and others. Now, the interesting thing is when you try brute force algorithms on this, which try every possible solution and then just pick the best one, they fail. They failed in the 1950s, they fail today because they simply don't scale. Why is that? Because when you have n locations, you have n factorial possibilities. So just a small example, if you need to go to 2,000 visits, which are even if it's just one vehicle, then there's 10 to the power of more than 5,000 possibilities. That's more than the number of atoms in the universe, and it just takes too long to even calculate 1% or 1% of that, right? So we need better algorithms, and that's where all of the research goes into. And one of the interesting things they found out quite early is that if you try to map reduce these problems, if you try to divide and conquer these problems, where you say, I take my traveling salesman problem, right? This one vehicle routing problem, and I actually split that up into 4 pieces, and I solve those 4 pieces optimally, which means for each of the one, I find the optimal solution. Might be brute force, might be something smarter. And I then put those 4 pieces back together. I just glue them together. You can see we take the shortest parts here, right, where we put these 2 pieces together, and you get the solution out of that. What you actually will find is that solution isn't optimal. It's far from optimal, actually. And this gets actually worse as you start adding other constraints, like multiple vehicles, capacity, time windows, lunch breaks, and many, many more constraints, which we'll talk about later in the session, right? So you cannot split up the problem. You cannot solve it brute force, so you need smarter algorithms, right? And so that's where a lot of the research goes into. Now, around 1970, they actually figured out that they gave a name to these kinds of problems. They actually figured out they're all the same, not just the vehicle routing problem and traveling salesman problem, but many of the other problems that we solve at Timefold, such as job shop scheduling and shift scheduling. And these problems are called NP-hard problems. That's just a mathematical term of saying that they're quite hard to solve, right? So how hard can it be? It's pretty hard. That's the answer, right? There's 60 years of research going into this, all the way from the 1950s. There's a lot of research going into this in all of this time. And when we talk specifically about the vehicle routing problem, well, the first version of this was introduced by the end of the 50s, again by Danzig, and it's called the capacitated vehicle routing problem, CVRP, right? The capacitated vehicle routing problem. And so what is it? It's basically very similar to the traveling salesman problem, is where we need to send, not one person, but multiple vehicles around to multiple locations. But if you would do that without any other constraints, with purely that one constraint to reduce the travel time or the distance, right, of the traveling salesman problem, you would end up with a solution that uses one vehicle, because it's always more efficient to keep using that vehicle. So they needed a way to, make it more real. And what they did is they introduced capacities. So they said, some of these vehicles have an amount of capacity, like 20, all right, 20 tons. And then every visit has a demand. And of course, the sum of the demands needs to be less than what can fit in the vehicle. That sounds pretty logical, right? Now,
Geoffrey, maybe a question from the chat. When it comes to CVRP, is it still solvable if the request that the things that need to be delivered, so the delivery order, exceed the fleet capacity? Is there something in the research that explains how you can deal with that?
Yeah, so basically, you have multiple options here, right? So in this case, they're all the same. No, it's apples and oranges, right? Okay. So presuming that you can put apples and oranges in the same space, right, and you can carry 10 tons with a vehicle, then carrying these 2,000 kilograms of apples and 1,000 kilograms of apples, so 2 tons of apples and 1 ton of orange, this would not be a problem. But if there are, for example, use a different space, then you need to actually a different place in the vehicle. You need to actually keep track of 2 numbers. You need to track of the apples capacity and the orange capacity, so you will need to make sure those never go above capacity either. And if you're talking about the case, what happens if you actually have to deliver more than what can be delivered at a particular location? So let's say that can actually fit into the vehicle. So let's say, for example, you can only carry 20 tons, like in this example here. and then you need to deliver somewhere 23 tons, the way to deal with that, the most practical way I've seen these days to deal with that is you just split it up into smaller bits, right? You split it up into like bits of 5, 5, 5, and 3. Now that might get you away from the optimal solution, and there's better ways than that to do that. But when you want to scale out for practical reasons, this is the default one I would suggest in most cases, right?
Thank you. I think that answered the question.
Thank you. So by the 1980s, Solomon actually, there was more research being done around this, and specifically around the vehicle routing problem with time windows, VRPTW, as the abbreviation goes, so vehicle routing problems with time windows. So what is time windows? Well, in time windows, we need to add another constraint, or sometimes you don't even have the capacity constraint there, and this is time windows. So for example, at a particular location, we can only deliver there in the morning between 8 a.m. and 12 and noon, basically, right? And so we need to make sure that we don't arrive too late or too early there. Now, the research is actually still active today. If you just go look on Google Scholar, you will see there's more than 10,000 articles just in the last year. Well, actually, since the beginning, since January, there's more than 10,000 articles that appeared, scientific papers that appeared around the vehicle routing problem. So there's a lot of research going on in there. It's a whole industry in its own, I would even argue, right? But so is it a solved problem, right? 60 years of research, all of this, can we just apply it, right? Does the research meet reality needs, right? And I would say yes and no. So it's a solved problem because we have a solution, and I'm going to show you that one, right? And of course, I'm going to talk a little bit why there's a big gap between what you will see in the research and what you will see in reality, and how we can maybe bridge that gap over time, right? So we actually have, in Timefold, we have 3 implementations. It's the field service routing implementation, the last mile routing implementation, and the pickup and delivery routing implementations. So if we have a solver, you have some quick starts in there where you can find some of these examples and some simple VRP problems in there already. But what we also have is what we call standardized models, which basically take on the full complexity of the real world, of reality, and which and this is the way we actually, this is our offering, this is actually how we pay for the development on the open source solver. And these are these 3. And these are REST APIs. So how do they work? You basically your software basically sends in the vehicles, the technicians, and the visits in the field service routing case, and we send back the optimized plan. So this is really for cases where you have a couple of visits per day, and you need to optimize sending people with the right skills and things like that, right? This is field service routing. This is basically the time window case, so VRPTW in the research terms, that means reality. And so it's VRP with time windows, and then 30 other constraints, basically, right? Then we have the last mile routing case, where we do the same thing, but that's for delivering packages or picking up packages or garbage or things like that. And there's the last mile routing case. And again, you send us the vehicles and the depots and so forth, and the packages, and we figure out the optimized solution. This is basically the capacitated vehicle routing problem meets reality, but funny enough, you have time windows in there too, of course, and vice versa. And again, a whole bunch of extra constraints, many dealing with stocks. And then, of course, you have pickup and delivery routing, where we need to pick something up and drop it off somewhere else. And this can be, for example, food or boxes or things like that. And again, you send us the drivers, and then you send us the shipments, basically the pickup and the drop-offs. And of course, our REST API sends back the optimized plan. And this is basically the pickup and delivery problem. I haven't talked about this yet, but yet another acronym you can use for Scrabble, VRP with pickup and deliveries, that meets reality. All of this is built on our open source solver, which you can find on solver.timefold.ai, which have some small quick starts of this, but these are much more fleshed out with all of the constraints you might need. So you can just use them, plug them in your software, start delivering value quickly. Now, what have we learned from all of that work? Well, a couple of things, and I want to go through those, right? And the first thing is, when I want to talk about location data, right? So when research location data meets reality. Because if you look at the research papers out there, you will often find references to the CVRP data sets, and they look a little bit like this, right? Well, this is one of them, actually. So what you will find here is, very interestingly enough, so this says, this is the data set name, it says it's Euclidean distance that it's using, and then you can find these numbers in there. And now the interesting thing about these numbers is that these are Euclidean coordinates. So they're not latitude and longitudes. So why aren't they latitude and longitudes, right? Because they were generated. It's easier to generate this, and because everybody's been using those in papers, everybody keeps using those, right? And so, but what's the problem with them? Well, Euclidean distances presumes that we're talking about a flat surface. So I have a little bit of a conspiracy theory, right? That all of this, VRP generated data sets, they're basically to promote flat Earth, right? I'm kidding, of course, for the record, right? But this is not reality, right? In the real world, the coordinates need to be latitude and longitudes, and we need to take into account the curvature of the Earth, right? Which brings us to Haversine. Haversine is basically where you presume the Earth is a sphere, which is close enough in most cases, and you calculate the distance based on that curvature of the Earth. Now, there's still a problem with that, is that it is as the crow flies. It still presumes that when you're delivering things, you can fly from location A to location B. In reality, you have to follow the road network, right? Presuming we're talking about vehicles that are cars, right? It's a completely different story when you start talking about ships and so forth, but let's keep it simple. Let's focus on cars right now, or trucks, or vans, or bicycles, right? So what you really need is maps integration, and with different vehicle types, of course, right? And so this is, of course, what we've done, right? We've actually integrated full maps integration and made it available to all of our models that are running on Timefold. And so we have the ability to support Haversine, like there are no maps integration, but it's without maps integration, basically. Road distance, travel time, and actually combinations of those, right? And I want to quickly show you that for a second to show you what the impact of that is. So here we go. So what I have here is I've run a number of data sets, and this is one with Haversine distance. And I just want to show you that one, quick visualization of this. So here's a data set that I've solved with the Haversine integration, and I'm plotted it on the map just for clarity, and you can see it has a total travel time and a total distance time, and these are of course complete nonsense. Why? Because it presumes that it drives at maybe 60 kilometers, 60 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, or something like that, and it just calculates that out and presumes that it can fly, can drive in a straight line from A to B. Right. So it's interesting for research purposes, but it's not interesting for reality purposes. Right. So here's a second run ident with the same data set, but this time I've actually used the maps integration, and I've asked it to minimize the total distance. Now, what we can see in this particular case is that now we have an actual amount of travel time, travel distance, as well as an actual amount of travel time, and these are truthful. Right, they're still estimates. You might still have traffic jams and things like that, but when you do scheduling, which is always something you do in advance, this is the pure nature of planning, right, and the pure nature of scheduling. So you do it in advance based on estimates. You're going to get as close to reality as possible, right? And that's very important to make good plans and to run your company's efficiency and your clients to run their companies efficiently. Now, we can also see all of the visits are assigned, so there's no unassigned visits, and there's a couple of other KPIs we can look at here and so forth. But we've actually turned all of these on, so these KPIs were actually not optimized for. Now, what I want to take a look at the last one is the travel time one. So this one using the exact same data set, right? And this time we've actually optimized on travel time, and that made a small difference. I'll show that in a minute, where we actually favored reducing the travel time over the travel distance. So this will actually favor taking the highways. And this is the first thing from reality. Nobody cares about distance. Well, one or two or three clients might, but in generally speaking, 95% of the people want to optimize their driving based on time, because time is money, basically, short answer. and the distance is at best a secondary thing to look at. Sometimes they don't care about it at all. In other cases, it's a lower weighted multi-objective thing that they add in, and of course we support that kind of things, right? So reality, look at travel time. Now, when you look at these two data sets, right, and let me just bring them all together again, what we can see is that if you look at the total, the top two ones in this particular case, you can see that the one that focuses on travel time is actually 16 minutes faster, and the one that focuses on distance is actually 30 kilometers smaller. So it's actually, you can clearly see that they're both going in the same direction. They both optimized a lot on both travel and distance time, but depending on what we favor, they do make a small difference. This is how we can actually push the schedule towards a certain thing that our stakeholders want us to do, right? Okay. It seems we're good on questions, so let's take a look. Okay. And by the way, you might wonder, were they really that different? You can see a small difference here, right? That's where they're different, but they're mostly the same. Well, the Habersign one is actually quite different when you look at the bottom side, right? So it's important to optimize for the real thing. Now, research doesn't just, when research meets reality, it's not just about location. It's not just about latitude and longitudes and dealing with maps integration. It's also about time data. And I'd like to illustrate that a little bit closer. So when you have a vehicle routing problem with time windows, remember that, right? Let me just first explain you how that works, those time windows. It basically means that if you have a particular visit, you can say that that visit needs to be visited between 1 o'clock in the afternoon and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, right? That means we cannot show up there in the morning, we have to show up there in the afternoon. And of course, our drivers also have working hours, which is also a time window. Now, if we, for example, assign visits C, then B, then A to Carl, right? And we could do any other order, but if we assign it this way, what we're going to see is that visit A ends up at 2 o'clock, right? And so if we look in the time window, we see that the visit is nicely between the start and the end of that time window, right? So the time window has a minimum start, the maximum end, and the start and the end of that visit is nicely between there, which is exactly what we want. What we don't want is if we have to show up there in the morning and we actually arrive there too late, which means that we will actually be staying there too long. We might actually arrive after they're already gone, after it's closed. We might not even get our foot in the door, not be able to enter the building, which is even worse, right? But in this particular case, we need to be there. It needs to be open there the entire time we work. So when that happens, we break a hard constraint, and this is not a feasible solution. So this is what happens with time windows. Now, what happens if you arrive too early? Now, you might think that breaks a hard constraint too, right? And in fact, and this is where the academic research, everybody gets it right already. This doesn't break a hard constraint. What actually happens is we push out the start of that visit until the start of the timing of the window of the time window, which means we create some waiting time. Basically, some time where the driver just sits there twiddling his or her thumbs, and which is fine. This can be a couple of seconds. This could be a long time. Now, of course, if it's a long time and you have a good solver, they will actually try to fill that with other work such that this doesn't happen, right? They will try to avoid that, try to get to increase productivity in general. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. There's actually many cases where it's a good thing, right? So in reality, what we see on top of that is we have to deal with multi-day planning. So we don't just have to plan for today, but also for tomorrow and maybe in the next couple of weeks. And when we need to do that, we might actually have certain visits that can happen on multiple days. So some visits have to happen on that particular day in the afternoon, but other visits might happen at any time because they're maintenance of utilities in the streets or things like that. Or they might have to happen at any time within a certain number of time windows. So you might actually have multiple time windows for one visit. So you might actually have like Mondays, you might actually have visit A. You can do it Monday morning, Monday afternoon, not during lunch because then we're closed and there's nobody there to let you in or let you do the work. or Tuesday morning, but there we open a little bit later because this might be, a breakfast shop or something like this. Well, not a breakfast shop, but any kind of restaurant, right? And then, and so we're going to actually take that into account. And when we actually sign a visit there on Monday, right, you can see here that this is the route for call on Monday. This will be nicely within one of those time windows and not without it, right? If you look at the vehicle routing at the VRPTW dataset, so the research datasets with time windows, what you will see is that they talk about these ready time and due dates. That's minimum start and maximum end, actually, right? And you see those numbers here. Now, it's interesting that those are numbers and not actual times like 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock, right? So there's no hours and minutes there, right? And again, that's easier to generate, that's easier to calculate, but again, it's not really like in the real world. Because in the real world, time calculation is hard. It's extremely hard. Why? Because there's things like time zones, there's things like daylight saving time, and there's a lot of things like things more, leap seconds and all that kind of fun. I estimate there's about 10 people on this planet who can actually do time calculation correctly, right, in any given scenario, right? And 9 of them probably programmed an API to do it, right? And of course, we're reusing one of those APIs, right? And you should be reusing those too if you do any kind of time calculation. Yes, we definitely want to deal with those correctly, right? So this is what we do in our data sets, right? If you look at one of the data sets you send to our servers, or if you work with, or you build a model, or whatever the case you do, what you will see is we make sure that the dates are in local date times, right? And you can see here, for example, that I'm saying for this particular vehicle that the minimum start is 9 o'clock in the morning of a particular date, and it leads to 5 p.m. in the afternoon, right? So clearly from 9 to 5, a job. But what you can also see is that there's a time zone, an offset in there. So this is actually an offset date. So it's not a local date, it's not a time zone date, it's an offset date, which is the best way, by the way, to send data back and forth, the most reliable way. Otherwise, you will get ghosts and bugs in your machine. More specifically, when I specify the service duration of a visit, that's actually, I can specify this is 5 minutes. Or I could specify this is 5 hours, or 30 seconds, whatever the case may be. So I can specify that in time. And again, when you make that into numbers, even from the epoch, you will get bugs. I can guarantee you that. So let me just show you a quick demo of that. So if you take one of these cases, right, like this travel time one. So what you see here, by the way, is this particular data set, how it optimized. So it took about a minute, and in that you can see how the amount of travel time actually was reduced, which is this yellow line, and it went from, in the beginning, about 53 hours, and went all the way down to 29 hours, as you can see here on the thing too. So this is almost more than 40%, I believe, that the improvement was in this particular case. Like I said, usually it's on average, but typically what we see is about 25%. Now, anyway, when we look at those input data sets, and what you will see here is you can configure a whole bunch of things, and this one actually, I've saved all of the configuration. But more specifically, you can see that we clearly specify the dates and times with their travel time. And of course, when we get back the output, and a whole bunch of stuff is calculated for us, what we'll actually see is that when we have a particular vehicle, like this case here, vehicle 2, it says this is the itinerary of that vehicle, I cannot pronounce that word, the route of this vehicle, then you will see it also specifies the arrival time, the departure time, and you get all of that information back. Now, it actually doesn't decide the arrival time and the departure time. It decides the order in which the vehicles need to visit those visits. Based upon that, each visit gets a calculated arrival time and gets a calculated departure time. So it's an indirect decision, not a direct decision. It's quite interesting to keep in mind. Okay. So here we go. Now, there's more constraints beyond these, right? And here we go. So there's things like lunch breaks. So what's a lunch break? Lunch break says somewhere around noon, Carl needs to get a lunch break, right? So what happens is he does a number of visits, and when then it's time to do his lunch breaks, that's 12 o'clock, he's actually still driving around. So we can't have him have his lunch while he's driving, so we have to wait until he stops. And then we allow him to get his lunch for an hour, and then he can do the remaining visits of there, right? So lunch breaks is what we call a floating break, right? And so this is something you will see, you will never see in research paper, or you will very rarely see in research paper, but it's something that comes across in every single thing, because it turns out that every single human being needs to eat. So, we need to make sure that our drivers can eat, right? Especially if we want to keep them and we want to make them, happy and increase our employee retention. Now, other things are fixed appointments. So your driver might actually have a dentist appointment, or you might actually, or vice versa, you might actually assign a particular job to a particular time. Your clients might just say that Carl will go to 2 o'clock to that particular location to do that job, and the planner, and the automated scheduling just have to schedule around it. So in that particular case, what we do is we do the same thing again, but we make sure that that particular appointment, like the dentist appointment, is set in stone, and then we will basically create some waiting time before it. And we, of course, will travel towards that location and travel away from it again afterwards. That's if we know the location. There's also the variant where we don't. Now, again, this is something that you have to deal with in the real world, and you have to make sure that you can actually put it into production. If you miss any of these hard constraints that I'm now explaining to you, and your users need those, they will not use your application. That's the most annoying thing about dealing these kind of planning problems, is if you have a 99% feasible solution, it's 100% useless. As I said in the optimization for all talk, you want 0% insane decisions, right? So an insane decision is somewhere where you break a hard constraint. You have to deal with skills, right? For example, if you have a job here that has to go to a plumber of at least level 2, let's say a meteor plumber, right? And we then assign that to an electrician. That's clearly an insane decision, right? A plumber cannot do the electrician work, and so an electrician cannot do the plumber work. So that's going to create water leaks and a whole bunch of liability. So that's clearly an insane decision that we don't want to make. So that will break a hard constraint. You might assign a plumber, but it might be a junior plumber, while you said we need a meteor plumber, so it might be a too low level. So of course we want to make sure we assign somebody who is at least that level. In fact, that's the hard constraint. There's a soft constraint next to this, which says that if the plumber is a level too high, like in this case, we have a senior plumber while a meteor plumber would suffice, then we would actually lose some soft points, because we want to avoid that. We don't want to send our senior people to jobs that somebody else could do. And of course, we could take that into account. Skills multiplier. That's also something that comes back in reality, and this really makes it interesting to implement. This really starts changing something. So what is this? You might say, this plumbing job takes 2 hours, and if I send Carl, that's going to take 2 hours. But I have some of my plumbers actually work a lot faster. So for example, Anne in this particular case, she might actually do all of the plumbing work twice as fast as a normal plumber. She's really, really good at her job, right? So when we send Anne, it's not going to take 2 hours. It's only going to take an hour, right? That's because she does all of the jobs twice as fast. Her multiplier is 0.5. And this is, again, one of those constraints that you need to take into account in reality, that you will see less in research coming up. Now, if you want to know all of these constraints, because there's a lot more, I could keep talking for another hour, but maybe that's for another webinar. But if you want to see all of these constraints, when you go to the information page of the model, you can access this without logging in. Actually, you will get a list of all of the constraints we actually support out of the box in the model, right? You can see and this is just the groups. For each of those, there's full documentation. If you click the docs, you'll find examples in JSON and so forth, right? Now, let me just show you that one run we had a minute ago, right, of travel time, right? So it just took into account travel time, but we could have taken all of these constraints into account. So we could have made it sure that we took into account service level agreements, that we made sure that we did the job before the service level agreement of that job was broken. That, of course, requiring skills and so forth, which I showed earlier, right? Minimizing the unnecessary skill levels, which I talked about earlier, and many, many more, as you can see in here, right? And this brings us a little bit to like, okay, how can you turn these on and can you start weighting them to each other? And of course, that's what you need to do in the real world, because you have multiple stakeholders. And it's not just about that, minimizing travel time. This is clear where this is the only constraint I've turned on in this particular data set. But in the real world, our users put in a lot of these constraints and they want all of them to optimize. And then sometimes you have to go and you have to make trade-offs. You're going to have to, break some to make others happy. And that's, again, the real world, right? What's also interesting is when research scale meets reality, because one of the problems I always had is that most of the research data sets I found go to about 1,000 locations in the vehicle routing problem. In the real world, you easily have thousands of locations, right? That you need to go to, thousands of visits you need to do. And because it's NP hard, that means that scaling out is actually your biggest thing you should be worrying about, right? It's not uncommon to create a brilliant solution for small data sets, to do everything you need to do there, be 100% correct, then try to scale it out and see that the whole thing doesn't work and you have to basically start from scratch, or you fail to put it in production, right? So the real challenge is scaling out. And so I want to show that too for a quick demo. So I've actually had a few data sets that I prepared here. And so I actually ran a data set with more than 2,000 locations. I ran this for 10 minutes. And so it actually fetched it fetched the distance matrix and things like this, the travel time matrix. You can see this is actually with full maps integration that this ran. And I get a solution, right? Now, if we start watching these graphs on the top, what you'll actually see is there's three lines here. The red line is the hard constraints, and this is always 0, right? This is the top line here at the top. That's quite simple because this model actually supports doing too much work, which is, again, a real-world constraint. Often there's not enough people to do all of the work, right? So in that particular case, we leave visits unassigned. And so that doesn't break a hard constraint. The red line doesn't go down. That breaks a medium constraint. That's that orange line you see here. So the first solution we actually found was actually leaving more than 1,000 visits, 1,500 visits unassigned, right? No, 1,200 visits unassigned. As we gave it more time, it actually assigned all of them, and it made sure that all of the visits are assigned. There's no unassigned visits, basically, right? But it needed some time to actually fit all of those in there. The second thing we do is we start optimizing the travel time and any of the other soft constraints, such as fairness and things like that. And you can see that takes a while longer to actually stabilize. And after we're here at about 7 minutes, what you see is that we start converging to a stable point. And so this is basically what happens if you deal with larger data sets. It takes a little bit longer for it to reach a stable point, but and of course you can limit that based on how much time you have available. But the amount of money you save while executing that plan is extremely large, as you can see in this particular case. Even with the unassigned visits, we still reduced more than 200 hours of driving time, right? So it's definitely worth waiting a minute longer just to get a better solution. It will save you hours during execution.
As Geoffrey, we had a question that I think is relevant for this one. Do the models include mandatory driver breaks? Because EU rules require 45 minutes rest after 4.5 hours of driving.
Right now, we don't have that particular one implemented yet, but we could easily add it in a couple of days. So we do have a couple of variants on that, but this is one variant, right? This is the EU variant. I've also seen I think the Australian variant, where you say every 2 hours you need 15 minutes of driving time. It's all the same thing. So what we will support in this model, as well, so in the field service routing model, as well as in the last mile routing as the pickup delivery model, is the ability to say, I want to introduce these kinds of driver breaks. And then you have multiple variations on that. So you will be able to say, yeah, every 45 minutes after 4.5 hours of driving, or 15 minutes after 2 hours of driving, like in some of the other countries. But which is quite interesting is, what happens if a visit happens? And for example, if they unload for 15 minutes, what happens to the 45 minutes? So you do a driving of, let's say, 4 hours, right, of 2 hours, right? not enough time so you drive for 2 hours, and then you unload things from the vehicle for 15 minutes. Do you then still have to do 2.5 hours later a break of 45 minutes or only 30 minutes, right? So there's many variations on that, and we will make sure we support all of these, following, of course, the regulations, right? Very good question, by the way. Yes. And if you want us to fast track that because you need that in our things, just let us know, and we can definitely take a look at it. But these is the kind of constraints that make it, go from, make it real, and everything else has to work together with that. So this particular constraint in itself is actually easy to do. It's once you start taking all of the other constraints into account, like multi-vehicle visits and things like that, waiting times for the appointments, floating breaks for the lunch breaks, and so forth, then it gets a lot of fun, and they all have to work together in harmony. And that's where the real work happens. That's where the real complexity happens. Thank you for the question. Good question. So multi-objective optimization. This brings us to multi-objective optimization. All of these constraints, all have to be taken into account. And you have multiple, and your client typically has multiple stakeholders, right? So the chief financial officer might say, I want to reduce costs, while the chief operating officer might say, I want to increase employee happiness, right? And so they don't leave, because that's also a big, in the end, the cost thing, but harder to quantify, right? So how do you deal with that, right? And so this brings us back to explainable AI. And I've shown a little bit about that earlier, right? If we can actually start saying, okay, so we have run configurations. So what we can actually do is we can create a run configuration, a run profile. And let's say demo 1, right? And then I can start saying, so this is default settings. I can say I care about fairness. I care about priority tasks. I care about SLAs, right? I don't care about this. I don't care about my visits being done earlier, so I put this on 1. I really care about that priority visits, those scheduling those optional visits, so I'll make that a bit higher, right? And this is how you can start actually saying, okay, you can start pushing what kind of schedule you prefer versus the other. Now, do keep in mind, if you talk to 3 people at any enterprise, they will give you 3 different answers, right? So obviously there's a bunch of tooling still missing here to still help them work together to do that. And of course, we're working towards that, right? And that will be available also in our platform. So I think I've seen the question pass by earlier, Tom, around real-time planning or something like that.
Yes, it has passed by.
Yes.
What do you do when change happens?
Yes. So once you make a schedule, by the time you execute it, it changes, right? And so this is called real-time planning. Optimization, scheduling is a moving target. It inherently is. So you have to deal with that, like it or not. So how do we deal with that in the field service routing model? So you create this batch schedule typically at night, right? Before you execute it during the day, but this could also be multiple days before. Doesn't really matter, right? So, and we use all of the information we had and all of the constraints to optimize that. And then you get a solution like this, for example. Of course, there will be more vehicles than Carl. Like there's maybe 300 other vehicles that we have to schedule, and all with a number of routes. But let's just focus on what's happening to this particular case. Now, what actually happens is during the day, during execution, it's now 2:15, and it turns out that Carl, when doing job E, he was a plumber there. There was a bigger water leak than expected. It all went south, and before you knew it, he was working there for 4 hours instead of 1 hour. So there's a huge scope creep on that job. Now, if you look at the rest of his schedule, if you would continue that as if just follow the plan as it was, right, and not adjust accordingly, you will see that he will end way too late, right? He will arrive a lot later at B and D, might not even be within their time windows, might not be maybe there's nobody there anymore to open the door, right? And so that's not a good thing, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to actually give that back to the solver, and to our REST API of field service routing of Timefold. And what then happens is, but we don't want it to change visit E anymore, because that happened, that's in the past. So what we're going to do is we're going to freeze a number of things. First of all, we're going to freeze visit E, but also visit B. This is very similar to pinning, but there's a small difference. With freeze, we just say a line. We just draw a line in the sand, typically 5 or 10 minutes from now. Like if it's now 20 past 2, we might say, you know, half past 2, right? We put a line in the sand, and every visit that has then started or that we're traveling towards is then frozen, similar to pinned. And then they can only change the things behind it. And of course, the field service routing implementation might take visit D and actually assign it to another employee, or maybe even unassign it if need be, right? So if you look at that with a case with 2 vehicles, right? Again, this is, in this case, it already happened. We're in the middle of the day. It's 1 o'clock. We have scope creep on visit D. We see visit C is, you know, will bring us back home too late. So we give that to the solver. We set a freeze time. It freezes everything up to this moment, and including these 2 visits, right? And then it moves visit C from Carl to Anne, as you can see right there. So I hope that answers the question. This is just one of the many cases of real-time planning. If you go to our documentation there, so if you go to the docs here, just the docs, right? What you will see is we have a full section on it with all kinds of cases, because it is really a can of worms. But you know, it's reality. You need, you know, you cannot miss it. And if there's one thing I truly miss in the research data sets, it's research data sets that you know, change, where real-time planning is part of the problem, right? And you have to deal with that because big difference there is you don't have a lot of time to solve it. You need to solve it quickly. And the trick is, of course, to do a warm start on the data you had earlier, right? Here we go. So I'd just like to finish with saying that research is quite different from reality, and I hope we can bridge the gap more and more, and that they can feed into each other more than they're doing right now. I kind of feel they're a little bit siloed these days, and I don't think that should be the case, right? Of course, we want to free the world of wasteful scheduling. I hope you join us, you know, using Timefold, using our REST APIs, using our solver, whatever makes sense for you. And I hope you can, together we can make this happen, right? So if there's any questions, and I see there were a bunch of questions, I'll happily dive into those right now.
All right, I flagged a few questions. Some people said keep the questions till the end. We're now at the end. If anyone still has additional questions, feel free to ask them, but I'll start with the ones that I started along the way first. So let's see, Christy asked, please, towards the end, for large routing problems, when is it better to use a partitioned starting solution? Have you used this, and what impact did it have?
Yes, I have used this. Once you get to about 5,000 to 10,000 locations, it becomes quite interesting. One of the reasons is, of course, purely the maps integration, the distance matrix becomes a problem because it grows quadratically. So that's already a good reason to start partitioning. And the second reason is because if you partition your data sets, you solve it separately and bring them back together, and then solve it again with the whole thing together, you can get better results than not doing it at all. So basically around 5,000 entities, 5,000 to 10,000 entities, I would suggest looking at it, but actually we are now solving cases with 70,000 entities where we don't even need it yet because we can see the flat line happening, right? So it really depends. If you look at your score graph, so I can show that here, right? So if you look at your score graphs, right, and you don't see that flat line happening, right? And you do have a good number over here. Your move speed is a good, nice high number, at least 10,000, right? Otherwise, you have other problems to deal with, I would argue. Then you do want to, and you're dealing with more than 5,000 to 10,000 locations. It's definitely an interesting thing to look at it. We actually have in the solver, we have a support for that called partition search. And yes, I think I've needed it very few times, 1 or 2 or 3 times. So let's say it's a very rare thing to use. I call it a sign of weakness also. Basically, use it if you have no other options. Try all the other options first. Yes.
All right, I think that answered the question. One more question from Siga. it was kind of somewhat answered, but I wanted to highlight it again. Is it a preferable way to handle manual changes to a planning, for example, by a planner, while the calculation is running?
Yes. So, while the calculation is running, that's an interesting one. So one thing we support is, first and foremost, the score analysis API. So you can actually send in, and I can show that, you can send in, let's do this here. So we have a REST API to send in the data set to solve, right, which is this one. But you can also ask for score analysis, which is this API. And when you do that, you can actually take your plan, make a manual change to it, send it in, and ask Connect score that, and tell me what hard and soft constraints are broken. Sometimes this will already, provide enough feedback to the user to say, no, I don't want to make that change. I forgot that if I do that change, it actually breaks a hard constraint, which I didn't think about, right? Now, if they do want to make the change, then and the solver is running. Well, here's the thing. What you typically want them to do is, when they make a change, they want to make sure that that change doesn't get undone. So you actually also want to pin that, and that's fine. You just do a real-time planning change where you say, okay, stop the solver, and you pin that, that change, that visit is required to go to that vehicle at that time period, right? And then you provide the thing again and continue solving, do a warm start from the solution you had before with the manual change on top of it. I hope that answers your question.
I think it did. Let's see. One was a question that has to be answered by mail. Maybe a bit more about the solver itself. So regarding the way the data is expressed, it's very different. When does Timefold express it into linear algebra? Words are difficult. Yeah. So when does Timefold transform that definition that you've shown into linear algebra, or does it at all?
No, we don't. We use meta-heuristics under the hood. Well, we use construction heuristic and meta-heuristics under the hood. So that's actually quite a good question to ask. So if you want to look under the hood, you can. All right. It's actually quite. Let's take this very big one, right? Here we go, and we go to the log output. I haven't opened this before, right? So this is really live demo fun, right? So you can see here at the bottom, see here solver starting, right? So what the solver actually did is, well, first we ran a custom phase. This is a little bit of our magic we had happened there. This is related to multi-vehicle visits, multi-resource visits. It was actually extremely hard to solve, and we actually had to produce a custom phase to be able to deal with that. Anyway, what we do afterwards is we run our normal construction heuristic, and we run our local search then. And so those are the two things we run. And the local search, specifically in this case, is a late acceptance local search. And so we don't use linear programming. And this allows us to scale on the vehicle routing case. So linear programming is great for particular use cases. For vehicle routing problems, frankly, it's terrible. And it doesn't scale. You would not be able to solve this data set with this amount of vehicles in a MIP solver. It's very, especially with fairness in there, which is something which is a quadratic constraint. Right?
Yeah, maybe fairness is something that we can cover in our next webinar, because we're kind of getting to the end. Yes. So what we would like to leave with today is the fact that Geoffrey has shown a lot. You can actually try this yourself. So if you feel like trying out this FSR model, but also using it with your own data, you can sign up for a test run. I dropped a link in the chat. So if you want to do that and get hands-on with this thing, feel free to connect us there. I will also leave some links to where we can keep talking and connecting, and a link to our newsletter, because we are posting a monthly newsletter with this sort of content. So if you're interested, follow us there as well. Then I think we're quite finished today. We're on the top of the hour. Geoffrey, do you have any closing words you want to leave the people with today?
No, just thank you, Tom, for hosting and moderating. And I saw a lot of questions coming by and a lot of answers from your side. So thank you. Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah. Okay. Then I think we can conclude here. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.
See you guys.